White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller made a bold and controversial statement last Friday.
The White House has tried various methods to crack down on illegal immigration. Here's Miller teasing a new one.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So to say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not.
Habeas corpus is the principle that allows people to fight their detainment in court. Miller's comments ignited instant criticism. Senator Amy Klobuchar wrote on X, "Congress is not going to reverse habeas corpus, and no, the president can't do it himself. Why does Stephen Miller bring it up on a Friday? To try to distract us from the havoc they are wreaking across the economy."
The Lincoln Project, a political action committee founded by former Republican Party members, wrote, "Suspending habeas corpus, let that sink in." Of course, many other conservatives were quick to point out the irony. Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk wrote, "The Lincoln Project is outraged about a president potentially limiting habeas corpus in response to a national emergency. Who's going to tell him?" Of course, Abraham Lincoln was famously someone who suspended habeas corpus, which is not something I agree with, to be clear. I do not think habeas corpus should be suspended. I actually have a lot of criticisms of Lincoln. I think it is helpful to occasionally remember that even our beloved greatest national hero presidents, Washington, Lincoln, FDR, Wilson has really had a historical reckoning that I think is good. Those other figures less so. Did things violate FDR, beloved, progressive architect of the New Deal, interned Japanese Americans. Lincoln violated all sorts of civil liberties in his prosecution of the Civil War, and so on. I think that's always helpful to remember. I don't think we're going to disagree here. I am not in favor of suspending habeas corpus at this moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point about Lincoln is that there is the provision in the Constitution to suspend habeas corpus in cases of rebellion or invasion, as the public safety may require it. Plainly, in the case of the Civil War, you couldn't get a more textbook example of rebellion. To your point about the other presidents, FDR, for example, and the internment of Japanese Americans, to me that's just an indicator of the fact that this stuff never works out well, that the suspension of liberties or transgression of constitutional norms is always a bad thing.
Yes.
Now, the Trump administration, and Stephen Miller in particular, are using the argument that there is an invasion going on by illegal migrants. That is an argument that not only I don't believe, which is neither here nor there, but courts have already struck down in several cases, including a Trump-appointed judge in Texas in relation to the Alien Enemies Act, saying that it was unlawful for the Trump administration to detain or deport people on that basis, saying there is not an invasion. So to me, this is part of a piece of the Trump administration's push against civil liberties generally and expanding presidential power in a very, very dangerous way.
And the expansion of presidential power always backfires against your own cause. And if I was to try to, persuade a MAGA or a conservative person why they shouldn't get on board with this, I'm not even sure everyone in the administration wants to do this. Stephen Miller, to my mind, is increasingly one of the most out there in the kinds of very authoritarian statements he is willing to make to the press. He frankly seems to enjoy doing that. I think he loves riling up the media by saying authoritarian things. And
yeah, but I think he believes the authoritarian things, which is where the danger lies.
I think he does. I think he thinks there would be no problem with authoritarianism as long as Trump is in charge.
Exactly.
I think he just doesn't see any of the slippery slope downsides.
Right.
I think slippery slope arguments are always correct, as I've told you, and we don't look, as you noted, we don't look back fondly on times where we allowed our liberty to be compromised for some public safety measure. Maybe unlike you, I see why conservatives would term the extent of the illegal immigration we have coming into the country, they would use the term invasion. There is a lot of disorder at the southern border. I wouldn't really bother myself quibbling over that point, but I would still say in response to that, well, how much liberty are we willing to lose to deal with that problem? And I would point to we don't need to go back to Japanese internment or the Civil War. We can point to the very recent example of the War on Terror. This is within our lifetimes. This is 25 years ago, where in a moment of genuine concern for our country, for our safety, we didn't know, we have enemies everywhere all of a sudden. It's very dangerous, very scary time. We allowed our government to take a lot of our liberty in the name of public safety. And it was wildly popular to do so. And Republicans and Democrats, a couple crank fringe members
Sure.
on both sides,
Sure.
your Ron Wydens and your Ron Pauls and your et cetera, objected to it, but everyone else pretty much marched in lockstep. Now, on a bipartisan basis, we really do recognize a lot of that as overreach. It is no longer controversial to say, man, I wish we had not given the Patriot Act so much leeway. Man, I wish we'd not done a lot of this stuff. The same liberties we will suspend to deal with the illegal immigration problem, I bet we would come back in a couple years or a couple decades and say, man, we went too far on that because look what we have to deal with now.
Sure. So for a start, there, in relation to the September 11th example, there's an old phrase, foul deeds require fair trial. And it's the idea that public outrage shouldn't be allowed to meddle or hinder or damage the basic administration of justice, or for that matter, the administration of civil liberties. Now, in the Trump administration's case, what I would note is rhetoric from Stephen Miller and others that has been hitting against the very principle of the judicial branch having its own authority. They don't seem to believe that it should have that authority. The Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, where the man was wrongfully deported in contravention of an immigration court order, the flights under the Alien Enemies Act that were ordered to turn back and were not done so, the suggestion that judges are involved in a judicial coup. This is an administration that does not really believe in pluralism or the separation of powers or the checks and balances, and therein lies the danger.
Right. I mean, their view is we were democratically elected to correct some of these problems, and we're willing to use extreme measures to do it, and we're not going to let the justice system stand in our way. We have a public mandate to do it. We won the election. That's their view.
Right.
I don't agree with that view. That is their view, and I would respond to it by saying, but you're not going to win every time, and we can't design systems from the conservative perspective that will be easily abused by progressives or Democrats or anyone else.
Well, and the government of the United States should not act unlawfully. That seems a fairly basic bedrock principle.
How about that? The Trump administration has granted refugee status to white South Africans. We'll get into that next.